Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Opposition candidate Lee Jae-myung is on track to win South Korea's snap presidential election, according to exit polls following months of political turmoil. The next president faces a divided nation, economic uncertainty and a challenging relationship with Donald Trump. Hamas says Israeli fire killed 27 and injured around 90 at a distribution site in Rafah, making the third deadly incident in as many days. Israeli forces say they fired near the area after spotting suspects and are now investigating. Moscow says a meeting between Vladimir Putin, Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump is unlikely anytime soon, despite US signals of readiness. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov stressed that the talks can only happen once Russia and Ukraine reach a basic agreement. The White House says US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping will likely hold a long-awaited phone call later this week. The move comes as trade tensions escalate, with Trump accusing Beijing of violating a recent tariff reduction deal. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and French President Emmanuel Macron met in Rome today to mend strained relations. The two leaders, often at odds over migration and European strategy, are now looking to find common ground amid shared concerns over US policy shifts and Europe's role in global security. The United Nations says over 4 million people have fled Sudan since war broke out in April 2023, calling it the world's worst displacement crisis. The conflict, now in its third year, has pushed millions into neighbouring countries amid escalating humanitarian needs. The Kremlin has refused to provide details on a Ukrainian drone strike that Kyiv claims damaged dozens of nuclear-capable Russian warplanes. Spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that only an investigation is underway, urging reporters to wait for official findings. Geert Wilder's far-right PVV party has exited the Dutch coalition government, prompting Prime Minister Dick Schoof to resign today. The move is expected to trigger snap elections and could delay key NATO-related defence spending decisions. Now, our top story today. Preliminary results are coming in from South Korea's snap presidential election, and it's shaping up to be a close race. With just under 24% of votes now counted, the National Election Commission reports Lee Jae-myung leading with 47.81%, while Kim Moon-soo trails closely at 43.99%. This snap vote was triggered by the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol, who was removed from office earlier this year following his controversial martial law decree. Voter turnout has been remarkable, reaching 79.4%, the highest in a South Korean presidential election in nearly 3 decades. Lee and Kim present sharply different visions for the country, from AI-led economic modernization to business-friendly tax and energy policies. The final outcome is expected to become clear by midnight, and whoever wins will have to navigate a deeply divided political landscape and growing security challenges from day one. We're now joined by Dr. Satoru Nagao from the Fellow Hudson Institute located in Tokyo, Japan, to discuss this election in a bit more detail. Dr. Nagao, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. This is a very important election for the country of South Korea today. It's been a very long process watching President Yoon Suk-yeol, former President Yoon Suk-yeol, go through his impeachment trial. He has now been impeached. South Korea has been in political turmoil. How important of a day is it for the political future of South Korea?
This is very important election because if the South Korea change the president just now, of course it is impossible to keep for Moon to keep their status. But anyway, if they need to change status now, they need to face a new situation in the world. Because currently the Trump administration changed the rule of the world at a very rapid pace, and so he is leading. And so South Korea's government should adjust such kind of situation. But in this case, relatively right-wing government has the advantage because the Trump administration policy is right. But currently, there is a high possibility that next president will be the President Lee, the left-wing side. So that's why can their policy adjust President Trump's policy of the United States? That is a matter of concern. So U.S.-South Korea relation will be something very tough situation in the near future after the new president will go in. But that is the current situation we can expect.
Yes, and Dr. Nagao, if you could you mind taking us through both candidates? We have the Democratic Liberal Party and the People Power Party, formerly of Yoon Suk-yeol. Could you tell us a bit about what they both stand for?
In the survey before the president election, of course, the opposition party has the advantage because of the failure of the current government. But at the same time, when we check the result of this president election, the current ruling party is catching up the popularity of the opposition party. So now the 4% difference is, of course, the opposition party has the advantage. But that kind of close gap means that a certain number of the South Korean people believe current ruling party has the advantage to deal with President Trump's policy, I believe. So that's why still many South Korean people worry about the policy of the opposition party, I think.
Yes, and the new leader of South Korea will face some challenges, whether that's at home and abroad. Could you tell us some of the issues that the new leader of South Korea is going to have to face?
In this case, most biggest difference between the current party and opposition party is their China policy and the North Korea policy. Simply said, the current party is relatively strong against North Korea and China, and the opposition party, which will win the president election, is relatively friendly with North Korea and China. So, of course, in case of China, the South Korea cannot change the U.S. policy, so that's why they need to follow the U.S. policy. But at the same time, when they try to talk with North Korea, the South Korea's perception, especially opposition party's perception, is China's influence is very useful. So South Korea should cooperate with China to persuade North Korea. So that's why such kind of idea itself is not popular in the U.S. and Japan now. So countries around South Korea do not like this idea, but in the South Korea, the opposition party, which will win the election, is tended to such kind of the policy. They will choose, I think.
Dr. Nagao, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. We now move over to Europe, where Russia is blaming Ukraine for deadly railway blasts that killed 7 people and injured dozens over the weekend. The incident took place in the Bryansk, near the Ukrainian border. A road bridge collapsed onto train tracks, derailing a passenger train. Russia's investigative committee calls it a terror attack and said it was carried out under orders from the Kiev regime. Authorities recovered explosive fragments and are interviewing survivors and witnesses. Just hours later, another blast hit a rail bridge in the Kursk, derailing a freight train and injuring the driver. Meanwhile, Ukraine's SBU security service has claimed responsibility for a strike on the Crimea bridge. They say underwater explosives damaged pillars of the strategic road and rail link. Ukraine claims Russia uses these routes to move troops and weapons to the front lines. The Kremlin says investigations into the attacks are still underway. We're now joined by Cliff Smith, who is a national security and government affairs professional located in Washington, D.C. Cliff, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. We have seen all this diplomacy go on in the past 24 hours, Cliff, with the second round of direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. However, allegations of war crimes, allegations of terrorism seem to continue to fly between both sides. What's your reaction to the attitude of each country to one another and the hopes of a possible peace deal being negotiated between the two countries amidst this violence, which seems to be escalating?
I'm not sure that violence is really escalating in any meaningful sense. The violence was escalated in February of 2022 and hasn't really abated since. Russia invaded Ukraine, a sovereign country, and has sought to destroy it. They have been explicit about this for a very long time. Very little has changed in that regard. The only thing that has changed is the posture of some of Ukraine's friends, including the United States, which believed that there was a peace deal to be made, frankly, in spite of much of the evidence. The Trump administration came in saying they could solve this in 24 hours. It was always a fantasy. It was never true. And we've just seen that play out in very real ways. The Russians, if anything, came in thinking they could get even more than they had already gained because of that stance, and have continued to push that continually. I don't think that the talks that are ongoing currently have a realistic chance of ending the war, because Russia has fundamentally not accepted the idea that Ukraine is a sovereign country that exists on its own and should, something they agreed to decades ago, and the Ukraine has tried to chart its own course in ways that Russia doesn't like. There's a saying that says Russia only believes in borders if there's Russian troops on both sides of the border. That seems to be their only acceptable outcome. And as long as that's Russia's only acceptable outcome, we are going to see this fight continue. Really, is what needs to be done is Russia needs to change its war aims.
Yes, and Cliff, we've seen Russia call it the Kiev regime, which caused these bridges to collapse. When we're talking about information warfare, how are both Russia and Ukraine utilizing this? And what impact does this have on international perceptions?
Well, I mean, clearly Russia wants to minimize its own atrocities and its own ongoing, aggression against Ukraine. I mean, look, a bridge in a war that is being used to transport material and troops to the front lines is a legitimate target. Now, whether the fallout from a bridge blowing up hurts others is unfortunate, but a sad reality of war. The real question is who is at fault for the war? Who is the aggressor? Who is the one that is willing to create peace, and who's not? Russia does these things as a matter of course to Ukraine. I was in Ukraine a few months ago. I was in Kharkiv, which is a large Ukrainian city just 20 miles from the Russian border. The amount of damage done to Kharkiv, which is not near the front lines, or has not been in the front lines for several years anyway, and continuing to be done to civilian infrastructure that has no military purpose, was frankly shocking, and was something that happened as a matter of course all the time. Russia's looking to create sort of a false equivalence between the two. Now, is that effective? Yeah, to some degree it is, sadly. I definitely see those kinds of arguments popping up, trying to blithely, say that they're all the same, trying to say that, all sides are doing this, when there's meaningful differences. Hitting a bridge that may or may not, depending on if you believe Russia, have hurt, civilians on a train, it's most unfortunate, but it's simply not the same as, for example, when I was in Kharkiv, witnessing a large hardware store, which was blown up, had no military purpose, and 16 Ukrainians died. This was just last year. And I could cite many other examples. But this is the sad reality of war. I do hope for an end to the war, but I hope for an end to a war where it is made clear that the sovereignty of countries is important. It's the same, I feel, with India and Pakistan, frankly. And it's a very similar situation between Russia and Ukraine.
I want to briefly talk about this Operation Spiderweb, which you've seen over the past 48 hours. Russia are now launching an investigation into it. Declined to give the numbers right now. a very impressive operation from the Ukrainians. What does it say about their military capabilities when some would say that the international narrative was that it was falling apart for the Ukraine on the battlefield?
Yeah, I think that was always a Russian talking point. That was the case, but it never was true. The truth of the matter is, Ukraine, while it is true that it is, very heavily reliant on international aid from the U.S., from the EU, from a few others, while that is true, the idea that they were somehow out of cards, as President Trump once put it, was never true. And it was obvious to anybody that's actually visited on the ground and actually talked to people there. Not only are they dedicated to fighting, but they are innovating at a rate, frankly, far faster than the Russians are. And they have been able to survive this long because they have been able to change to and adapt to changing circumstances. This is a key example. I mean, everybody knew that drones were a significant, weapon on the battlefields before the war in Ukraine and in Russia. But the nature of those drones, their importance has changed rapidly. And it's largely because of Ukrainian intervention. I mean, yes, others have innovated as well. But I mean, the speed and the importance of those innovations have changed and have become much more important to the war. And Ukraine's been winning on that front. And they're continuing. While I was in Kyiv a few months ago, I visited actually what amounted to a drone innovation facility where they were learning to make drones more effective, cheaper, to take out, more expensive, clunkier drones, and they were really making amazing progress. I don't want to take away the fact, it is true, Russia's innovating too. This is a tit for tat, back and forth, both sides are doing their thing. But this is a clear sign that Russia simply was not prepared for the level of innovation and the level of cunning, frankly, that the Ukrainians have. And they, probably with a few $1 million have taken out not only billions of dollars of Russian military assets, but they've also, probably caused the Russians to spend an inordinate amount of time figuring out how to guard other assets inside Russia that they previously didn't think they needed to. It was a huge win, and it will change the dynamics of the war. To what degree? That remains to be seen.
And Cliff, obviously, you said that previously said that this war has maintained a steady pace when it comes to the conflict. However, this is such a substantial military operation for the Ukrainians. Is there a risk that Russia will reply in such a way, in a excessive way, in a way that it feels like it needs to get its own back on the Ukrainians?
I have no doubt that the Russians will do something to try to make some sort of symbolic, big attack to, sort of reset the narrative in a sense. I have no doubt that'll happen. However, I do not think it'll have the same level of impact because, frankly, Russia's already been doing everything it can to destroy Ukraine, and it has been for some time. And the idea that they have some sort of substantial, military asset just sitting here waiting to, increase and to, heighten the situation is just not true. They already have been throwing pretty much everything they have. Yes, it is true that they have not launched nuclear weapons, but it is true that they threatened to do so about, 1 million times. I'm exaggerating, obviously, but it's so common that nobody really takes it seriously anymore, and it's not in their best interest. They know that that would be the one thing they could do, which could turn almost 100% of the world community against them. So they won't do it. They can't do it. And so really, it's just a matter of them, probably doing some kind of spectacular attack that will, hurt a lot of probably innocent civilians. But it's unlikely that they're going to do anything that really changes the war, because if they had the ability to do anything that really changed their fortunes on the ground, they would have done it. They've been pressing the envelope for some time. I was in Kyiv when President Trump was on the phone with Vladimir Putin, and a few hours later, they were hitting Kyiv with drones. They do that. They are attacking every city in Ukraine when they get a chance on a frequent basis. So, how are you going to escalate that? Yeah, they can throw a whole bunch of drones at one place or another. They can try to make a move in the front line to move things a few miles here or there, a few kilometers, I should say. But it's not going to change the calculation, I don't think, in the same way the Ukrainian attack on Russia's, bombers has done.
Yes, and Cliff, there's been mainly US officials and also Zelensky saying that this war will be solved through diplomacy and not the battlefield. We are running out of time, but on the diplomatic front, how do you see this progressing? How have you evaluated the progress over the past 48 hours where we did see those second round of peace talks with Russia and Ukraine, and we've seen a new prisoner swap arranged? What are your thoughts?
Diplomatic progress is great, provided it's sustainable. And there is no evidence at this point that any diplomatic progress, beyond minor things like prisoner exchanges, I don't want to take away the importance of them, but they're not going to solve the war. It's ephemeral until, basically the Ukrainians have decided to capitulate, which they haven't and shouldn't, or the Russians think they have no other option but to seek a truce that will leave them well short of their stated aims. They have to change their mind about the outcome of the war. And when you have one side wanting to survive and the other side wanting the other one dead, it gets really tricky. You basically need one side to have a victory and to change the other person's mind about the desired outcome of the war. And I don't see that happening in the short term. Russia has a history of pushing way too far on a variety of fronts. I mean, that is what caused them to collapse in 1917 and again in 1990-91. And do I expect that to happen right now? No. But I do think that it's going to take a massive amount of internal pressure that will really shake the foundations of Russia for this thing to end.
Cliff Smith, thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure to get your insight on the programme. We now stay in Europe, but before that we have some breaking news coming in. 5 people have been killed in an attack on a UN food aid convoy heading to North Darfur in Sudan. Several others were injured. That's according to a joint statement from the World Food Programme and UNICEF. We now move over to Europe, where Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof has said that he would step down. This comes several hours after Geert Wilders, leader of the largest government party, had to quit the right-wing coalition. Ministers from Wilders' PVV party will leave the cabinet, while the remaining ministers will continue for now in a caretaker government. The other parties in the coalition now have the option to try and proceed as a minority government, though they are not expected to. Any election will likely not be held before October, and the formation of a new government traditionally tends to take months in the fractured Dutch political landscape. This comes as the hard right is growing in Europe, with anger over migration and the cost of living at the risk of eroding Europe's unity over how to deal with Russia and the US. Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof said that the decision of far-right MP Geert Wilders to withdraw from his party from the cabinet was unnecessary and irresponsible. Dutch Foreign Minister Caspar also called Wilders' decision scandalous. Let's in fact listen in.
Onverantwoord. Er is oorlog in Europa, een paar voeten hier vandaan in Oekraïne. Er is oorlog rond Europa, de landen in het Midden-Oosten. Dus Trump, tarieven, allemaal heel belangrijke handelsproblemen voor een open economie als Nederland. En op dat moment van tafel weglopen, ik vind het gewoon.
We're now joined by Ross Feingold, political risk analyst who's located in Taipei, Taiwan. Ross, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Ross, this seems to be a pattern going on in Europe, political instability. We've previously seen it in Germany and other countries. What are your thoughts of the current political state of Europe as a whole? Is there some discontent going on?
Certainly. We've seen a lot of governments in Europe not last very long. We've also seen changes from left to right in many recent elections in Europe. And clearly the question of immigration is something that voters genuinely care about, and they're making their thoughts about immigration, inbound immigration into Europe. They're making their thoughts known at the ballot box when there are elections. And then we also have leaders like Geert Wilders, who brings down a government when he feels that the government that he's participating in, that his party is participating in, isn't doing enough on immigration, or is really still too open-minded. One of his concerns and the reasons why he brought down the government is he felt the government, that his party was part of the coalition, he felt they were still too open-minded to inbound immigration. So he decided to walk away.
Yes, and Ross, what are the limitations and responsibilities of a caretaker government? This says when they're not going to host or establish a new government by the next few months at least. What are their limitations and responsibilities that this caretaker government is going to have to look after, and what are the difficulties that they're going to face?
Well, typically the difficulty a caretaker government has is they're not able to pass any significant legislation. That's really the nature of a caretaker government. So I wouldn't expect any significant legislation, whether that's to do with immigration policy or other policies, to occur over the next few months until they have an election. But they are hosting a NATO summit, so it's extraordinarily embarrassing for the Netherlands that their government is basically going to be a caretaker government at a time that they're hosting a NATO summit. And I think that's also why we see the other coalition partners are extremely angry with Wilders, because they're really thinking, like, if there's any time to hold back and at least show some unity, it's when the country is on the international stage. And hosting the NATO summit puts the country on the international stage, but now all the news reports about the upcoming NATO summit in the Netherlands are going to talk about how the government is just a caretaker government. So some of the other parties in the coalition are just extremely angry with his decision.
Ross, given the fragmented Dutch political landscape currently, what challenges and timelines are anticipated in forming a new government following the expected elections in the autumn?
Yeah, that's an important point. The elections are not expected for another 4 months. And then typically the negotiations to form a coalition, because no party, it just looks really unlikely based on recent experience that a single party could form a government on its own, including Wilders' Freedom Party or the PPV. So it's really likely that another coalition will have to be formed, and those negotiations will take many, many months. So it's very likely that there won't be a new Dutch government until the spring or even the summer of 2026.
Ross, one final question. What are the potential economic impacts that could result from this Dutch political crisis, both domestically in the Netherlands and also in the EU?
Well, anytime that there's a caretaker government and political instability that may last, frankly, another 9 to 12 months, it makes investors hesitant to invest in that country. So inbound investment into the Netherlands is probably going to take a hit. And another important issue to keep in mind is one of the most important companies in the semiconductor sector is the Netherlands company called ASML. They produce the equipment that is used to manufacture semiconductors by all the major fabs around the world, including TSMC here in Taiwan. Samsung buys their equipment from ASML and other semiconductor manufacturers as well. Now, the United States under the Trump administration is trying to impose restrictions on the export of ASML's most advanced equipment. And now there's a situation where there's just a caretaker government looking after the interests of Dutch exporters. That's simply not a good situation for the Netherlands economy to be in.
Ross Feingold, thank you very much for joining us. Well, that's all we have time for, and we will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world. Thank you.